Appreciate your patience with that. Let me just note really a couple things actually about the syllabus. So let me just talk about that just very briefly. These are just reminders, no changes here or anything different here, but I did want to point out a couple of things about the syllabus. So as you'll notice, you should have read through the end of section 2 of book 2, the Doctrine of Essence. You should have read through the end of Appearance. I'll talk about most of that today. If I get to the end, it'll be good. If I don't, then we'll clean it up next time. We'll take it up from there next time. But next session, the next class session is on the 5th, obviously November 5th. And the assignment there is, I have you reading all of the actuality chapter, which is nuts, right? Not because it's long, just because it's dense, right? It's very dense. So if you read it and go, I didn't understand a bit of that, come to class, right? I'm not going to clarify all of it in class, but you're fine, right? If you think, if Hegel's been a mystery up to this point, that's even more mysterious. It'll be okay if you just do that. That's why, here's the weird thing, you'll notice that the following session, which is our final session for the quarter, is a review and discussion session, because you will have finished doing all the readings you need to do next week, right, for the class. If you're behind, now's the time to catch up. And we'll need those 2 sessions to work on it. And then if you've actually looked at next quarter, if you're staying in, going to be with us for next quarter, you'll notice that the first session next quarter is still about that same part. It's about actuality, because again, that's how important and how significant it is, also how dense it is, so it'll take some time to work through. So yeah, I just want you to be aware of that. The other thing, obviously, is the exegetical paper assignment is due by no later than, I'm sure you're all ready to turn it in now, you're welcome to do so, but by no later than Monday, November 25th, 11:59 p.m. at D2L. So there's a folder online for you to do that. Please be sure you get those in, no extensions, no excuses, that's just what it is. Put it in there, and whatever you have, put it in, right? That's the best thing to do at that point. All right, questions, issues, problems about any of that mechanical sort of stuff for the class? How the class operates? Issues, problems? All right. Then I want to come back to the material we were talking about last time. So as I said last time, I really appreciate your patience. I put you through a lot of stuff last time, a lot of stuff you should have asked and I'm sure did have a lot of questions about, so I want to come back and talk about those. But and I'm talking particularly about the material on identity and difference and contradiction and on into grounds. We'll talk about those. That'll be a focus of what we do here in just a moment. But I want to situate those for just a moment, right? So the way I want to situate them is by recalling just a couple of things we've talked about, things we've been through. But I think it could be useful to just remind ourselves of this, to kind of frame that discussion. What's going on in identity and difference, what's it all about? I mean, it's easy, right, sometimes to say, okay, this looks like an excerptable thing in Hegel. Here's this little diatribe on identity and difference, and there's 3 kinds of difference, and they all end up in contradiction, so there you go. We can just kind of treat it that way. And we're going to look at the details of it again in just a moment, but it's important not to excerpt it from its function within the overall argument of the text. So what I want to do is recall a couple things. One is straightforwardly about that overall framing, and try to give you a kind of a diagram. I'll draw it up here, it'll be horrible, but hopefully useful. And situate our discussion of that account of identity and difference there again through that. So just a bit more patience and then we'll be to that. Is that okay, fair enough, makes some sense? So I want to recall a couple things, so 2 notes, the way I put this, 2 notes from last time. So I think at this point, I've called this out before, I just want to call it out again so we're all clear about it. We have observed a pattern that recurs throughout the accounts. We've seen it in quality, we saw it in quantity, we saw it in measure, in the doctrine of being. We'll see it also in the doctrine of essence. I'm about to talk about it there again. So let me just remind you of this pattern. And I want to be careful here. It's going to sound like I'm talking in terms of stages. Stage 1 is this, stage 2 is that, and that's not really what I want to say. I want to say there's these 4 aspects or 4 dimensions of Hegel's analyses that we've been seeing borne out thus far. He's not sitting there going, now how do I fit it into this form, right? He's saying, if you unpack this is what it entails. And what we've been able to note is that it entails a kind of always having these 4 dimensions to it, right, if you put it in those terms. So the first dimension, right, the first aspect of this pattern, I would say, is relata. So let me use that term for that, relata. So we've noted that one basic category is shown necessarily and eminently to entail a second basic category. So for example, in quality, we saw that if you're talking about reality, necessarily entails negation. If you're talking about something, necessarily entails other. So those are the rule, right? If you're doing in quantity, right? We start off with discreteness, necessarily entails continuity, or you can do the reverse, right? They necessarily entail one another. If you're talking about extensive degree, you necessarily have to talk about intensive degree. These are the relata senses. What I mean by that is you have these moments, these categories, these concepts, that are mutually dependent on one another. Hegel's claim there each time is you can't think reality without thinking negation. You can't think something without other. You can't think discreteness without continuity. You can't think intensity without extensivity. They all are mutually implicative, mutually dependent on one another. So he's making a relata claim at that point, right? That's just isolating the moments there. So that's the first dimension, right? We'll see. And so, kind of Hegel 101 is once you get a category, you can know that the unpacking of that category is going to entail its own transformation. There's not another category that shows up from someplace else, right? The other category comes out of the fact that this category itself determines itself to be other than itself, right? It actually transforms itself, negates itself, and becomes other than itself to be that other category. So there's the two relata that stand in relationship to one another. So that leads me to the second aspect, second dimension, not only the relata, but the relation, an intrinsic relation, right? Because these aren't two moments that are just happen to be plugged into one another in some kind of way or come into relation to one another. They have a mutually implicative necessary dependence on one another. So these mutually dependent basic categories, the relata, are shown then to be defining moments of a more fundamental intrinsic relation. So again, we've seen this repeatedly. We've seen it in qualitative determinacy, we've seen it in quantitative determinacy. In qualitative determinacy and in quantitative determinacy, it's the notion of bad or spurious infinity, right? These two determinations are always in relationship to one another. They're related to themselves, and when they're related to themselves, they go on changing to infinity in both qualitative terms and in quantitative terms, right? One of the main messages of the doctrine of being, the logic of being, is that whether we're talking about reality or quantity, whether we're talking about quality or quantitative determination, they're unstable determinations unto themselves. They are transformative by virtue of what they are. And that's always going to be, and we're going to come back to this point in just a second, because as Hegel tells us at the beginning of the doctrine of essence, that's because in the doctrine of being, you always have being with non-being. Being always with non-being. It's afflicted with, affected with non-being. So reality, it looks like it can stand on its own. Quantum looks like it can stand on its own, but it can't. It's afflicted with non-being. So that overturns it, right? Sends it into a kind of alternating set of states that it's constantly going through. So both qualitative and quantitative determination are necessarily transformative of themselves. Right? By virtue of what they are, they're transformative of themselves. The other simpler way to say that is being with not being is necessarily becoming. It's another simple way of putting that same basic point. These are at deeper levels to say that. So relata and intrinsic relation. Then finally, or not finally, but third dimension, process, right, process. So the relata and the relations are then both shown to be produced by an even more fundamental process. So if you think back about qualitative infinity, quantitative infinity, qualitative spurious infinity, to ad infinitum, right, the non-finite infinite. Or you talk about that in quantitative spurious infinity, the non-finite quantity. We can increase to infinity, we can decrease to infinity. Those are actually generated by a process that undergirds them, which is what he calls true infinity. True infinity. So qualitative infinitizing, as we call it, just to give its verbal processional nature. Quantitative infinitizing is the same thing, but on a different dimension. So if you asked Hegel, what is the nature of being? It's qualitative, it's quantitative. What does that mean that it is? It's becoming. What's that becoming? That becoming is generative of those determinations that we're talking about, right? Both qualitative and quantitative determinations. Things are discrete because of that process. They are real because of that process. So far, so good. Now, in a lot of cases, we would just say, well, that's Hegel, there's three, so we're done. I think Hegel actually, there's a fourth dimension here that Hegel's insistent on, and I'm separating it out in this last bit because I think it's significant and important for the reasons I'm about to talk about when we go to the other side of this. But so think about now, we've talked about the relata, they're moments of relation, and that relation is engendered by, produced by, constituted by an underlying process. So far, so good. But Hegel doesn't just say all things are in flux. Hegel says there is a logic, a structure to that process, always. And he never stops by just saying, there's this thing going on, right? And it's giving rise to everything else, and man, just stand back and watch it, because it's amazing. You should be in awe of that. No. He says that has its own unique endemic logic, its own unique endemic structure. It is, in other words, rule governed. It's rationally intelligible. It's not a happenstance. It's not arbitrary. It has actually rule governance built into it. It has an intelligibility, a structure. These are terms that I'm using to try to explicate what Hegel's talking about here. So I would then say the fourth dimension is to talk about the structure or the logic of the process, the generative process itself. So the process is then shown to be rule governed and thus possess an identifiable structure. In qualitative infinity, notice we said that's what being for itself is, right? Being for itself is just the name for the othering whereby things come to be what it is, nature, the structure of that process. We saw this in quantitative infinity with the ratio of powers. It comes to be itself by raising itself up, right, to its own self, right, not to something outside it. So it becomes other in order to become itself. We see this both in qualitative and quantitative infinity. Infinitizing. That's the structure of the process itself. It's self-relation in and through self-othering. I think all that should be fairly sensible. The details, how it works in quality, how it works in quantity, how it works in measure, are issues, I grant you, but at least that pattern of analysis we've seen repeat itself pretty consistently through. Does that make some sense? So we can see that same basic pattern of analysis, that same basic pattern of argumentation at work in the transition from measure, from being, to essence. So let's just talk about that transition. We did this last time. Let me just walk you through in those four dimensions how that operates here, because this is really not within being any longer. This is transitioning out of being, and that's really what we want to talk about. So first, measure is shown to be nothing other than the relationship between quantity and quality. Those are its relata. That's its determining relata. And that always has to be thought as a relationship of alternating states and persisting substrate. So the qualitative changes, the quantitative persistence. There's the relata. But that means that there is an intrinsic relation between the substrate and the states. That they're not just two things that are in relationship to one another extrinsically or accidentally. They are necessarily related to one another. But as we saw, this is what's different about measure over against qualitative infinity, quantitative infinity, is there's measurelessness here. There is a measurelessness infinitizing that goes on here, but it's an infinitizing that doesn't stay within the domain and cannot stay within the domain of being itself. This is what forces us out of being itself to another dimension, namely to essence. So the substrate, so that's the relata, the intrinsic relation. Now the process, what is the process? The substrate that bears the qualitative states, the continuity that bears the changes in the qualitative states, is itself necessarily, proves itself necessarily to be a movement of positing, what he also calls relativity, what he also calls reflection. He's using those terms at that moment all interchangeably. We'll come back to this notion of reflection, obviously. And it's the process by which both the qualitative and the quantitative relata and their intrinsic relation are what they are. So it's what engenders both qualitative determinacy, quantitative determinacy, and measure their relationship to one another. So it's a process that engenders both. And that process, he says, now coming to the last bit, the structure and logic of that process. That structure or logic of that process is the structure or logic of reflection. So that's why he starts off, right? After he has that first bit, that first chapter in the doctrine of essence is about shine. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But he says, look, you want to know what being is? It's shine, right? It's just the guise. We can even say it's deceptive illusion at this point, right? Because we've now departed from that in some way. Right? We're no longer in the domain of the qualitative, quantitative, measure-less determination. We've had to move to a different dimension, essence. Essence is what measures, right? We can say broadly, being itself. Sets the circumference, sets the expanse, sets the limitation on being itself. How he does that, we'll come back and talk more about. But that does render being, at least initially. This won't be its final determination. But that, at least under that analysis, renders being pure shine. The surface, right? The guise, the layer of dimension at the most surface basic level. But what's connecting the two together is a process known as reflection. And that, he says, has a structure. So he immediately after talking about shine, he says, well, let's talk about the structure of reflection. And he reminds us, right? I know we use the term reflection to talk about a mental operation, the pathway of knowledge. I understand that. I give you that. It's a subjective term. We normally use it that way. I don't want to use it that way. He says, I want to use it as a movement of being. A movement of being. Not only or primarily in this case as a mental act. Of course we can reflect. Think about what you're doing. Yes, you can reflect in that sense. You can take for what's granted and think about it. That's reflection, of course. But he's saying you can do that cognitively. You can do that as epistemologically. Because ontologically, that's already going on in being itself. So we're showing up kind of late to the game in that regard, right? Epistemology is secondary to ontology for Hegel. We do that, right? We reflect because ontologically, there's already a reflection going on within being itself. It reflects itself out of itself into essence. So that takes us to this kind of setup. And this means that this is shine. So far, so good, makes a little bit of sense. So here's the relata, here's the relation, here's the process. So we ask the question, well, what's the structure of that process? Well, he tells you need to understand it in terms of its positing, in terms of its externality, and in terms of its determining. Now notice what Hegel is not saying. Hegel is not saying, hey, look, there's three different kinds of reflection going on. You got your positing reflection, that happens, and then once that's over, you get external reflection going on, that's a completely different thing, and once that's over, you finally get determining reflection. That's not at all what Hegel's saying. Hegel's saying, if you want to think about, and we need to think about at this moment, what's the logic of this process? Just like we thought about the logic of qualitative infinitizing, we thought about the logic, the structure of quantitative infinitizing. Here we need to think about the logic of the generative process again. We're coming back to the same thing, right? This is repetition coming back, but boring down deeper into it. We need to look at these three moments. So what does positing reflection mean? It means that it posits essence. It produces essence, the dimension of essence itself, not a particular essence, but essence as such. It produces essence. That's why the arrow's here, put it that way. But that means it always has to presuppose something that's given, being. Right? So positing reflection has this basic structure of it posits something, essence, but in order for it to do that, it has to take something else for granted, something from which, out of which it posits essence. So what does it take for granted? It takes being for granted. It takes being for granted as shine, or better said, it transforms it into shine by virtue of positing essence as its depth for this surface. So far, so good? Then as we talked about last time, there's that line where he says, this is where he tells you this is not three different operations of reflection. That in the very moment of reflecting and positing, right, essence, and presupposing being, the presupposing of being makes being be. So it's not a taking for granted in the standard way we think of it. The standard way we think of it is we get some given in, right, and then we reflect upon that. That's what positive reflection is. Positive reflection is our kind of standard garden variety understanding of reflection. You get something in and then, okay, I'll come up with some ideas about it. You'll posit some ideas about it. But that always is dependent on my taking for granted what's given in, right, what I've got in. But Hegel's point is that no, you don't actually take in something. That's too naive. Because being is generated in this very same process by which you reflect and posit essence. So to posit essence is also to posit being. Okay. Well, that's not positing reflection. Hegel says that means it's no longer merely positing essence. It's a form of, as he calls it here, extrinsic reflection or external reflection. Why? Because now you've got two things, two relata, you've got being, you've got essence, and they've been produced by reflection. Both have been produced by reflection. And now it looks like, this is external reflection, it looks like external reflection stands over against them, outside of them, extrinsic to them, and they stand on their own. So now you've got being, you've got essence, they're there, and yeah, you can reflect from one to the other, or one back to the other, but they stand on their own, right? Reflection as a process doesn't do anything to them. That's what external reflection looks like. So this is Hegel saying, look, once you've got those things posited, it looks like they can stand on their own. That's external reflection. But then, he says, the truth of external reflection is that they actually can't stand on their own. They are what they are by virtue of the work of reflection itself. That means reflection determines them. Reflection is determining of them. It generates both. Here's that moment of the process giving rise to the relata and the relation itself. Make a little bit of sense? Questions or issues about that? So that's why he's talking about positing, external, and determining reflection. So then we come to where we ended last class with, right? He says, okay, now that we've talked about the logic of this, just like he's done many other times so far in the book, right? Every time we got to the logic of the process, he gives it a little bit. Sometimes it's a peek at this structure. It's a very quick analysis of it, and then he's on and off to what the implications of that are, like he does with being for itself. He talks about one, many, attraction, repulsion, and then all of a sudden that's indifferent to itself, and that's quantity. We see the same thing with quantitative infinity, right? We get the ratio of powers, very short account of the ratio of powers. That's how quantity is what it is, but that means it's necessarily bound up with quality, and so we're to measure. Here is his longest thus far account of the process on its own terms, in terms of its logic. Here's its rules that it follows. And the basic rule is this: it determines itself as being other than itself. A thing we've seen before, but now it's determining essence and determining being itself. Make a little bit of sense? All right. So once he's done that, here's where he goes with that. And this is where we were at last time. So he says, look, what is it to be an essence? What is it to be determined as an essence? He says that's what an essentiality is. Right? So that discussion of essentialities, the essentialities are the determinations of reflections, he calls it, is just to be a determined essence. He's saying, what is it to be posited as an essence by reflection? What is it to be posited, to be created, to be engendered, to be produced as an essence? Essence in general, not any particular essence, just essence in general. What is it to be then? Well, he says it means it has to be an identity. Right? So he starts off by saying it has to be the same as itself. It has to be an identity. But that means it can't be difference. It must stand over against difference. Well, that's what it presupposes, is difference. And you reflect out of it identity. So there's the first move, right? Identity is related to a difference because identity stands over against, separate from, posited as separate from difference, which is given. Which is given. Now, he says the first form of that is absolute difference. Difference in itself. Parallels to identity in itself. He doesn't put it this way, but you could call this absolute identity. Right? Pure self-relation doesn't have any relationship to otherness whatsoever. Paradoxically, difference in itself has no relationship to anything that's other than it, namely identity. But as you begin to inspect difference, what do you find? That identity and difference aren't actually extractable from one another. What you find is that difference has to be thought of as diversity. We'll go through this. Opposition, and ultimately contradiction. We'll go back through this, but this is the pattern of the argument, is the diagramming of the argument itself, just trying to track it through. Now, what Hegel says about this, we'll go back and look at this analysis, But if this proves out to be the case, then to be an essence is to be an identity, but to be an identity is necessarily to be in contradiction with itself. Hear that again, because that's incredibly important for Hegel. To be an essence is to be an identity. It has to be self-related. Can't be an essence if it's not self-related. But to be self-related is to necessarily be in contradiction with itself. It is itself and it is not itself at the same time. It is in contradiction with itself. And because it's in contradiction with itself, so that's the first claim to sort of what? Essences are necessarily self-contradictory? Yep, that's exactly what Hegel's arguing. And because they're self-contradictory, not contravening that, but actually flowing out from that, they are necessarily the ground. Okay, how does that work? We've got a lot of work to do in here. But what the claim is going to be is that because they're ground, because they're self-contradictory, then they necessarily have to appear. That's where we get being is now appearance. It's not shine, it's appearance. Why? Because it's the appearing of the essence. And why must essences appear? Because they're inherently contradictory, that's why. Now, I don't think any of that is self-evident, right? You don't look at that and go, oh, of course essences are contradictory. And of course, because they're contradictory, they necessarily appear. None of that makes any sense, right? So let's work through those things. But that's the claims that he's making. To be an essence is to be an identity, but to be an identity is necessarily to be in self-contradiction. To be self-contradictory is to be necessarily appearing. That's why he can say, at the beginning of the appearance chapter, essence must appear. And Hippolyte famously said about that in Logic and Existence, that claim, essence must appear, is Hegel's way of saying, before Nietzsche said it, God is dead. Because he's literally saying there is no transcendent domain. Essences can't be essences and be transcendent. To be an essence necessarily means it must appear. So the Platonic domain, right, the Platonic realm of the forms makes literally no sense here. There can be no non-appearing essences. All essences are manifesting, are displaying themselves, exhibiting themselves, expressing themselves. Are they not essences? Why? Because they're inherently self-contradictory. Now, that at least gets us to this question about appearance and ground, right? Which is what we want to focus on for the rest of the session after we talk our way back through this couple points. Does that diagram make at least, I know it's sketchy up there, but make a little bit of sense walking through it? So the reason why I wanted to do this is one of the things I know is very easy to get lost in is the intricate details of any one of these moments along the way. They're all rabbit holes. You can dive down every last one of them. You can go into the remarks and figure out, oh my God, he's talking about Leibniz's identity of indiscernibles, and now we're talking about the principle of non-contradiction. You know, all that kind of stuff. And you can dive off and think, oh my God, what is this? And you lose track of the main message. The main message is this is ultimately about being an essence and what the nature of essence is by virtue of reflection, and what the nature of being is. Initially shine, second determination, we'll get to a third, called actuality next time. But this determination is appearance. That's determinations of being. You need to hold on to, this is ultimately a doctrine of essence, yes, but it's about the relationship between essence and being. Make a little bit of sense? Questions about that diagram? Helpful at all? Yeah. All right. Then let me just add one other thing here. And I just really want to reinforce a point I've already talked about before, but it's worth, I think, going into it in some more detail, at least reinforcing it. Hegel is very adamant that there's a different, negation is different in the account of the logic of being from the logic of essence. That negation is different, has a different status. It's not different, right? Negations that work in both of them, the same negations that work in both of them, frankly, but they don't show up in the same way, right? They're not, in the accounts, they play a different role. So he will say repeatedly, in the logic of being, in the doctrine of being, he will say, what you see there is being with non-being. Being with non-being. So you see this in something with other, continuity with discreteness, intensive with extensive, right? Quality with quantity, right? They're with one another. It's this relation of, they come into relation with one another, but that's it, right? They are relationships with one, and that's transformative, right? It's transformative for both of them. But it's always this with, being with non-being. And he says that means that one category, because it's always being with non-being, that one category passes over into another. So the primary language in the account of being, right, the doctrine of being sections, is always one thing, say quality, passes over, transitions, übergehen, passes over into the other. Right? It passes over into quantity. And then we see quantity, so it passes over into quality, and that's measure, and then measure has measurelessness, and then it doesn't pass over. Why? It reflects. Why? Because Hegel wants to say that in the doctrine of essence, the status of non-being has fundamentally shifted. That this isn't being with non-being anymore. That here we have being as non-being. Being as non-being. Being is negation. That's why we start with shine. Shine just is being as negativity itself. We would have said in the doctrine of being, what is being? Well, being is reality, qualitative determination. We'd say it's magnitude, right? It's got some quantitative determination. Those are things that are, and then you say, oh crap, right? It also changes. Why does it change? Because it has this non-being that it always bears with it, always comes along with it, and that transforms it into something else qualitatively, transforms it into something else quantitatively, and ultimately, nodal line, it does that in relationship to one another, and therefore it does it without any kind of measure that it can give to itself. That's my short 2-second review of the doctrine of being. But notice what's driving that is that the non-being is always accompanying being, whether it's something or quantum or measure or some kind of, it's always accompanying it and disrupting it. Not from outside, it bears it with a relation, but it's always something that's along with it. And Hegel says, but what we saw in the doctrine of being is that ultimately being negates itself. That's what the transition at the end of measure is really all about. It's that movement from, right, this is the measurelessness, this is that movement from, look, it can't just be the substrate bears these states, it actually has to be engendering of those states, positing of those states. If it's that, then it actually has that negativity built into it. So now the states, qualitative changes, being, have proven to be nothing other than negativity itself. That's why they're shine. That's why we start with shine. Because that's where being just is nothing. So notice it's a small change, but a pivotal change, an important change, right? That's why Hegel's arguing, that's why Hegel's emphasizing it. That we move from being with non-being to being as non-being. And so now we don't transition from one concept to another. We reflect from one concept to another. Reflection is the name then for this movement, which we had called transition. In the doctrine of being, we now rightly call it reflection, because it's reflecting out of itself. Each concept is reflecting literally out of itself into its own otherness. It's not being burdened with non-being, it's being defined by it. It is nothing other than that. So as he says, reflection is the first definition he gives of reflection. Reflection is the movement from nothing to nothing, right? From shine, being as nothing, shine, to nothing, the negation of shine, which is essence, whereby both moments come to be what they are, and he says, and by virtue of that, the whole thing comes to be. It comes back to itself. So reflection is that ontological process whereby being shines, whereby all that is, and essence reflects or posits being as what it is, namely as negation, as shine itself. All right. Now, that then takes us back to this account of identity and difference. So think about this as, here we see the relata, here we see the relation, here we see the process, here we see the logic and the structure thereof. Same pattern of argumentation we've seen before. And then Hegel wants to say, okay, let's focus on essence for a moment. What is essence as determined by that process? That's the question at the beginning of the identity difference chapter, right? What is essence? What is it to be essence? By virtue of its being posited by reflection, it's generated, engendered by this process of reflection. And he says, we know minimally it has to be an identity. It has to be the same as itself. But to be the same as itself means that it's other than that which is different, non-identical. So the non-identical must be being. So here we retread this, we repeat this progression. This is like positing reflection. We posit self-identity. We presume then, we assume then, we take for granted then that it's not difference. But what do we soon learn? No identity without difference. Why? Because identity is what it is by virtue of not being non-identity. That's their relation, their minimal relation. And then Hegel begins to say, okay, is that just a bare assertion? Is that just a bare claim? Is it just merely a positing? Are we just taking for granted what being is as difference? And then saying, what's other than that, right? What we're going to reflect out of that is get this abstract or absolute notion of identity. He says, well, yeah, but the problem with that is that, as we saw with the positing reflection in general, to posit this identity means we're generating that difference. The difference is not given. It's not presupposed, it's not taken for granted. It's generated too. It is what it is by virtue of that same reflective operation. So here we go, from positing to external, to extrinsic to determining reflection. It's going to say, okay, so let's look at the difference side of this equation. We start with absolute difference. What is it? Does it have any identity built into it? Well, it does to a certain degree. That's what we have here. Dissimilarity and similarity, that's what diversity is. There's the relationship of identity and difference built into the very notion of diversity itself. And you'll say, okay, but wait a minute, this is all just extrinsic, right? That's external. We're just comparing features of things. This is Leibniz's principle of indiscernibles, right? Two things are not the same as if they have any kind of property that makes them different from one another. You know, Leibniz famously says in the letter to Clark, no two blades of grass, right, are exactly the same. No two leaves are exactly the same because they have some kind of feature about them that makes them distinct from one another. So the identity of indiscernible is, well, everything's discernible, everything's diverse, variety, various from one another. And we want to say, right, but that's a principle of reflection, right? This is the way Kant takes it up in the first critique. And he says, that's the way in which we ascribe similarities and dissimilarities to things. That's extrinsic reflection, right? But Hegel says, but wait a minute. Dissimilarity and similarity, those are actually mutually implicative of one another. They're defining of one another. You can't have one without the other. And that's not just us doing that. That's not the act of comparing that does that. Sure, we do that. But the act of comparing, external reflection, is not just external. It's determinative. It's in the things themselves. It's negative and positive. In other words, what looked to be merely an extrinsic relation is actually an intrinsic relation. You can't have one without the other. So far, so good? Then here comes the nasty bit. Right? But if negation, the negative, and the positive can't stand alone, can't be what they are without the other, then the negative is always already in the positive, and the positive is always already in the negative. I'll say that again, because that's crucial. If the negative and the positive can't be defined outside of one another, they're necessarily mutually implicatory, reciprocally determining one another. And that's not something we do, but that's in the things themselves. Then positivity is already within the negative is already within the positive. They're not just related to one another, yeah they are, but they're definitive of one another. If they're definitive of one another, then they are born within each other. And if they're born within each other, then the negative and the positive are one and the same thing. They're the negative A and A. They're in contradiction with themselves. Hegel's claim, right, is that oppositional relations, like positive and negative, are such that they are definitive of one another, right? But because they're definitive of one another, that means that relation can't be extrinsic, can't be exterior. Better said, the other moment can't be exterior to the moment that's being defined. positive can't be exterior to negative, negative can't be exterior to positive. But that means that positive is in the negative is within the positive itself. But that means that whether we're talking about the negative side or we're talking about the positive side, they are literally in contradiction with themselves. They are themselves and they are not themselves. They're A and not A. At that point, Hegel is saying, it's always good at that moment to sort of back out and think, okay, kind of crazy, but what is he in general saying? In general, he's saying this: to be in essence as determined by reflection. To be in essence, and that's the only way there is to be in essence. To be in essence as determined by reflection means you've got to be an identity. But to be an identity means you're necessarily going to be in self-contradiction. There is no such thing as an essence that's not in contradiction. It is itself and is not itself at the same time. That's the argument. I just want to let that set for a moment, right? Because that's a large enough pill to swallow. And I want to go back through that and work our way through that again. But notice what he does with that. So having established that, Hegel then wants to say, this is where we ended last class, because, not in spite of, not, oh my God, they wish they got rid of this is a real problem, they got to get over this. No, precisely because essence is self-contradictory. And for no other reason. Because it's self-contradictory, it is necessarily ground. So it can't just be identity, it's got to be ground, because it's contradictory to itself. Why? Because to be in self-contradiction means it is itself, but it's not itself. And the moment it is itself, gives it its integrity, it's a ground, but to be a ground is always to be a ground of something else. So it others itself. Because it's in self-contradiction, it others itself. How does it other itself? By appearing. All right, so there's a tracking of the argument, the pathway we've been on. Make a little bit of sense, at least in terms of the road marks along the way. Yeah, from here.
I get this is a very, very, very basic question, but I feel like I get the mutually dependent and imprecatory status of negative and positive, but somehow I feel like the negative plays a more important role than the positive. Now, I don't know why.
I mean, at this point, the negative just means that which is other. It doesn't mean negation in the sense of what's othering. It just means the other, right? Just like difference means that which is other than identity. So I don't think it's doing more work than the positive in that respect. It's just noting two different poles around which similarity and dissimilarity have to be determined because of what they are. So that's what I think Hegel's doing with that. Does that make some sense?
Yes.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. There's a negation at work here, yes. But is the negative the moment of negation? No, not really. It's the marker for one side of, it's what difference becomes, right, over against identity, when identity can't be separated from it. The positive is identity, the negative is the difference pole. It's when they can't be separated from one another, that's what they become. But that means that identity necessarily is difference. And difference is necessarily identity. Now, we used to like to say, right, people still love to say, oh, there's the identity of identity and difference, right? There you go, that's Hegel, right? And we still hear that, because Hegel said that early on, we still like to use that. But notice that's not what he says. He doesn't go, oh, all is wonderful now, right? We now have the identity of identity and difference. What he says is, that means that essence is self-contradictory. And his first claim about that, we'll get to this in just a second, his first claim about that essence is self-contradictory, is that renders it a nullity. Vacuous, empty, void, nothing. So no celebration at that point, right? He's saying it's completely and wholly destructive of what an essence is. It is null, that's his term, not mine. Right? It's void, it's empty, vacuous. So I caution ourselves about, oh, now we got the identity of identity and difference. That's not what happens. as far as Hegel's analysis takes us. Does that make some sense?
Okay.
Other questions about the diagram? Helpful, not? Or? Yeah, Susan.
I was kind of confused at the last part.
Yeah.
Because there is like the two sides and there's like the process, but the two sides aren't processual, just the middle.
Yeah.
So I'm just confused of like how do we read like the transition from like difference to like the whole process of diversity, opposition, contradiction, and then what is the reasoning that you do to go from the process to the static part?
No, thank you. So I'm not sure. Let's start from there. Right? But it seems to me that here's what Hegel is doing, in effect. That what he's done is he said, okay, you want to know what the structure of the activity, the process is? It's this. So he gives us an account of positing, external, and determining reflection. And then he says, okay, let's go to essence. We've been talking about being this whole book. Now we finally got this thing called, this category called essence. Let's focus on one of the relata, right? Not the relation, not the process that gives rise to it, not the logic of that process. But let's just look at one of the relata, essence. What is it to be an essence? As determined by, that's why it's essentiality. What is it to be an essence as such? I called it last time, and I think this is still right. What are the rules of essence formation, right? What is it to be an essence as such? And he says, if we're just talking about that, then we're looking at identity. Right? Minimal determination of what it is to be an essence. It's the same as itself. It's in pure, absolute self-relation. That's all it is. A equals A. But then he wants to say, but it is that only by virtue of its not being, right? The other side, the other relata. So it goes back to the other side and says, but the other relata is still involved here, but it's involved here purely as a contrastive. It's over here. It's not that. So we can talk about absolute identity. He doesn't call it absolute identity, but that's in effect what it is. Absolute identity. And then he says we can talk, this is the first determination of difference, absolute difference. Difference, he literally calls it difference in itself. Purely self-related difference. Well, those are the two relata. That's being and essence in relationship to one another. Shine and essence in relationship to one another. But then he says, okay, but let's work through now not the process. The process is going to become involved, right, as we'll see. But let's just work through the relationality that's going on here. So we got the relata, let's go to the relation. And he begins to work through the relation and says, well, initially it looks like diversity. Similarity, dissimilarity, that's the positive, that's the identity difference relationship. So they're not absolutely distinct from one another. They are contrastes in relationship to one another. Some things are similar, some things are dissimilar. There you go, you've got that. But that's purely just extrinsic reflection, whereas the first bit was positing reflection. We posit the essence over against what we take for granted, difference itself. Identity over against difference is taken for granted. He says, no, they have this relationship to one another. Well, that means that they're being compared, so that looks like extrinsic. He constantly says, this looks like a subjective doing, right? Something that's done to them. It's not true of being itself, it's something ascribed to being itself. He says, no, these are actually ascriptions that we make of things, absolutely that's the case. But just as we saw with extrinsic or external reflection, it's necessarily determining. It's necessarily determining. So what looks to be just similarities and dissimilarities, likeness and unlikeness, Gleichheit and Ungleichheit, we find it's actually oppositional. And what he means by oppositional is it's not us ascribing it. He means it's not an act of extrinsic reflection. He means it's an act of determining reflection. This is part and parcel of what it is to be the being itself and what it is to be identity itself. So there's the positive and negative. So I would say at that point, so that doesn't get us quite to contradiction yet, but that's a working through of the relation. From the relata to the relation. And then what you get in contradiction is this claim about, oh look, the two sides, the two relata can't just be two relata. They've actually already got to be included in one another already, always already. They have to be there. So this isn't a temporal sequence, one day we had diversity and then we woke up and had opposite, no. This was ultimately always already the case. So contradiction means they're both embedded in one another. That means they're in contradiction with one another. And then notice immediately what he says about that. And that means that two things. It's in contradiction with itself. It means that it renders itself void and null, but it also renders itself a grounding relation. So now this grounding process, here we get a process, is what we're going to talk about. And that's the appearance. Now we can say, not that that's shine, but it's air shine. Right? We get this appearance. He plays on those terms to try to talk about that. So then he's going to give us another account of, okay, what's this grounding relationship? and what's the process by which it operates. So we'll return to those two dimensions. Does that make some sense of that?
Can I ask some follow-up questions?
Sure. Yeah.
So I have like two questions here. The first one is, a lot of the times it feels like he's making like an inference and kind of like making like just doing it according to his own will, and I know that it's not the case.
Making it according to his own.
It's like the movement from like essence to, it's like, why are we even starting from the, like, what is the necessity in starting from one side? That's the question that I have, like, what is the necessity in doing like, oh, essence of course is identity, like it makes sense, but it feels a little bit inferential.
Okay. So arbitrary.
Yeah, a little, yeah.
So notice what he's done here. This is his account for that, right? He said, look, what has being been determined as? At this point, because it's been reflected into essence, the total and complete determination of being is not being with non-being, but being as non-being. Shine. It's the nothing.
Yeah.
Right? That's all it is. Has it lost its qualitative and quantitative and measured determination? No. But those are all rendered purely shine. They are the surface level dimension of something that looks to be the more fundamental depth. Right? So that's how we got to here. So he thinks the determinations thus far of being are exhausted. There are no more determinations for being to be taken up at that moment. So that's why we look to the other side of the relation. We look to the other relata, we look to essence. And then we say, okay, what is it to be an essence qua the product of positing, the product of reflection itself. That's why we move to essence, and we talk about essence first as identity, and then we look at its relationship. Immediately we go back to the relation, right? Having looked at one side, we say, oh, it's an identity, over against difference, which is given. But it's not given. It's produced. Produced in this way, produced in that way, ultimately this one.
It's like that left side is just a result.
In the doctrine of being, and certainly up to actuality, all the way through appearance, there's a disequilibrium, there's an imbalance here. This is more fundamental, this side, essence, is more fundamental than being. He's crystal clear about this in what he calls the essential relation. Right? The essential relation is the grounding relationship that says the ground is more fundamental than the grounded. Being is grounded in essence, which is the ground. That's what he means by the essential relation. So there's clearly a priority, ontological, logical priority at that point of one side, essence, over against the other side, the depth over against the surface. Yep.
Okay.
It won't stay that way, right? Because we're about to look at something called absolute relation, where that very disequilibrium, that very hierarchy, is going to be undermined for reasons we'll talk about. Right? And then we won't be talking about appearance anymore, we'll be talking about what he calls manifestation.
Yeah.
So we're not there yet. So at this point, we can say, what does all this give us? It gives us a grounding relationship between essence and being. That's necessary. That's necessary. To be an essence is to be a ground, and to be a ground is to show itself, to display itself, to shine through the shine, right? To display itself in the appearance. I'm sorry.
So just like, this might sound really stupid, but so like that side is where fundamental is doing the work, and then this side is like what is positive, the result. But we move from difference to diversity, to opposition, to contradiction. It makes it seem like we're starting from the being side, just in this chart. And I guess I was a little confused by that.
I think that's true. I think we are.
Okay.
Because what we're doing is we're saying, okay, to be an identity, it has to be other than difference. So we're starting out from positing reflection.
So on that side, we're looking at that presupposition and working backward.
Yeah,
Okay.
Exactly.
That makes
That's a good way of putting it. So this is presupposed,
Yeah.
and this is positive, to use the initial language of positing reflection. Right?
Yeah.
This is given, this is what we're going to generate out of the given. And so if we start off with difference, how do we generate identity out of it? Right? How do we reflect back
That's
to
our starting point,
and produce, right, create identity out of it? Well, we do so initially by noticing where things are similar and where they're dissimilar. But that can't just be where we notice it. It has to actually be true of the things themselves, positively and negatively. So they're different in certain ways, they're similar in other kind of ways, they're positively alike, they're negatively dissimilar and unlike in other ways. But that can't just be a feature that we ascribe to them, that's got to be grounded in the things. The fact that no two leaves are the same is not a feature of our ascription, it's a feature of those leaves. And if it is the case that that's true, then the negative and the positive is existing in reality itself. It's part of being in those terms. Then the positive side, right, negative side as well, but we're talking about the essence side of things, right, the identity side of things, can only be what it is by virtue of not being what it is. It is itself by not being itself. It's in contradiction to itself.
Yeah, thank you so much. That helps a lot.
Is that useful?
Yeah, it really shows that like reflection is the ontology side of reflection, because that whole process is just logic but also reflection.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense.
Other questions, comments? Yeah, please, yeah.
But there's an appearance on there twice. I was kinda
Yeah, I mean, this is technically appearing,
Okay.
just to be clear about it. It's a verb, and it's appearing. Does that help you? Neil?
Yeah.
Other questions?
But it only
Alright.
appears after
Please.
being ground, right?
Say again?
It only appears after being ground, right?
It appears, in its appearing, it is ground. And only by virtue of its appearing is it ground.
Yeah,
I think that's what you were asking, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So when is it ground? Only when it's appearing, right? So when he says essence must appear, you could translate that as essence is ground only when it appears, right? So only when it's doing the work of grounding, right? Only when it's actually producing appearance, what he also will call concrete existence. Only then do you have essence being what a ground is. They cannot be what they are unless they appear, unless they ground. Those mean the same thing. Is that useful?
Yeah.
Now, if that makes a little bit of sense, then let me take us back all the way to like the first couple of sessions and plug in some names here that can be useful to kind of think through the critiques that we talked about, right? So remember we said that one of the major critiques of Hegel's logic is panlogicism, right? That everything is rendered to be logical. And Schelling famously puts it this way, he says that, that Hegel is a panlogicist because he renders everything in the concept, right? Everything is a moment of the logical, everything's a moment of the concept. And, this is oftentimes thought, this account is oftentimes thought to be one of the proofs of that, right, going on. Because why? Because he's saying that everything that might look like it exists outside essence is actually a moment of essence itself. This is another way of rendering what I just said to be the case, right? So we said, well, there's two versions of that critique. One of those versions is the ineffable, something exists outside of logic, that logic draws upon and can never fully articulate. It's always straining after and trying to say it, but it always exists beyond it. And the second version of that is the critique from the immemorial, where we say, no, it draws upon something, a reservoir that it draws upon of difference that's given, and then it tries to articulate that, and that's what logic is. But both, whether we're talking about the complete and wholly other, the ineffable, or we're talking about the reservoir, the milieu, the matrix of difference that it draws upon, both of those are given, they're outside of the logic itself, they're outside the logic of the concept itself, outside the movement of logic itself, and therefore they're both, they exceed it, and therefore they're not able to be drawn up into the panlogical movement itself. Make some sense? So, if we talked about absolute difference, we could say that's a pretty good description of Levinas's position and Adorno's position. Levinas says ethics precedes ontology. What he means by that is the relation to the other, the wholly other ultimately, but the other, right, is always an absolute difference that cannot be drawn into any kind of relation ultimately. It always exists outside and exceeds every bit of it. Every self-relation is always torn asunder, he says, by the relation to the other, right, that calls me outside myself. Adorno famously says, what do we mean by the non-identical? We mean that which won't go into the concept. The object won't go into the concept, he famously says. This is in negative dialectics. So there's a version of this kind of absolute difference. It always stands outside of and generates, in Adorno, negative dialectic. In Levinas, it generates the struggle to do a phenomenology of that which exceeds phenomenology itself. Diversity. That's Deleuze and Derrida as far as I can tell. Both of them, Deleuze and Derrida, reference this discussion. They both appeal to diversity to make their points, whether they're talking about difference in the case of Derrida, they're talking about differentiation, multiplicity in Deleuze. Why do they do that? Because Hippolyte taught him to do that. right? Hippolyte's logic and existence says precisely this, that this moment right here, this movement from diversity to opposition to contradiction, is the speculative moment itself. So Deleuze famously says, okay, I'm going to take you at your word about that. I'm going to say that's what Hegel's actually saying, and here's what I'm going to say back to you about that. To push difference up to contradiction, which is what he accuses Hegel of doing, Hippolyte of doing, is to do what? It's to render difference phenomenological. No. Hippolyte's whole book is about how the science of logic is not about phenomenology. It's not about anthropology, which he equates. What is it about? Ontology, he says. So when Deleuze reviews that book 2 years after its publication, this is his doctoral advisor. Right? He's saying, when you take difference as diversity and you push it up to, that's what he claims is going on here. This is a dogmatic foisting of diversity up to contradiction. Then what you've just done is you've rendered it difference susceptible to being seen by human beings. Why? Because what it is to be in contradiction is to be this thing and not everything else. To be this thing and not all the rest. To the rest. This is where I guess the term rest, by the way, remains. And they both want to say, right, there's where difference gets subsumable under identity. That's where difference gets subsumable under identity. That's the critique, right, from Derrida and Deleuze. Derrida will say, well, it's not about that there's a more ontological conception of difference, which is exactly what Deleuze says at the end of his review of logic and existence. He says, could we not have an ontological conception of difference in itself? By the way, that's the program of difference and repetition. He already has that in 56, 54. He writes a book later. But that's already the program. How do we figure that out? And for those of you who are following along at home, like trivia stuff, Hippolyte's example of diversity in logic and existence is Bergson. One who thought like this, one who thought about finding the similarities and dissimilarities, who thought about, when you have something and light and it goes through a prism and you find its similarities and its dissimilarities, you let salt dissolve and you find its similarities and that's this. That's Bergson. And Deleuze says, the hell it is. That's ontological difference. That's not phenomenological, anthropological difference, which is what contradiction is. Derrida's version of this is more Heideggerian, right? Derrida wants to say, well, diversity is already predetermined to be subsumable within identity. It's a teleological constriction of difference. It's already on the way towards its being subsumable within it. Now, a couple things to say about that analysis, right? One is this. I don't think any of that captures what Hegel's actually doing here. And number two, this isn't the final account for Hegel of how negation, differentiation works. This is the account in the doctrine of essence. And the book doesn't end here, for good reason, because he doesn't think that actually captures how differentiation, the notion of determinate negation, that process actually works. We have to get to the concept logic to get that. Make some sense? Right, questions? I held off questions last time. Questions about that? Issues?
It's more an anticipating question, but would it make any difference if we wait until the concept section? Because in the concept, even like difference would be subsumed under the concept, like everything would be subsumed.
I don't think that's the case. We'll see when we get there, right? But at least, I think we ought to withhold judgment about that, right? Because I think you could say even here it's not being subsumed. The whole logic of subsumption, that whole metaphor, that whole operation of subsumption of difference just doesn't make sense here, right? What it's doing, I think, right? Tell me if I'm wrong. I can't be wrong, quite often am. That what it's showing is that for an essence to be an essence, it has to be other than itself. That's what it's showing. It has to be itself and be other than itself at the same time. It has to be in contradiction with itself. Not that it is itself by not being everything else. That's how Hippolyte reads it, and that's why they read it that way. But I don't think it shows that. I think it shows precisely what I've tried to suggest, which is that it is what it is by including its other within itself. Now, in Derrida, this is in the opening chapter in Margins of Philosophy, Timpan, where he says the defining move of philosophy is that it always tries to identify its other, right? Its own proper other, right? The other that belongs to it. And that's this. That's what he thinks is going on here, right? He thinks that this is a way of, because that's the way Hippolyte phrases this as well. He says, like, this is the essence's own other at that point, right? It belongs to it. But I don't think it belongs to it in the sense that it owns it, it takes possession of it, subsumes it. It belongs to it, but belongs to it in such a way that it actually undermines it, essence, right? It undermines essence's integrity. Yeah, please.
So every time we do 3 hours of this, I get more confused about the ontology side of it, because when we go into so much detail and we're parsing out all of these moments, it's very hard not to think that he's talking about logic as it pertains to thinking.
Yeah.
But
When we
it's
think
not.
about difference, here's the
Yes.
way we think about difference,
Yes.
right?
When we think about being, when we think about essence and reflection,
Right.
there's
And that's a
still-
caveat, right? That means that we're just doing epistemology, I'm putting words in your mouth,
Yeah.
but we're doing epistemology and not doing primarily ontology. then.
Going back to the Kantian distinction
Yeah.
between the noumenon and the phenomenon.
Yeah.
But that's not what we're doing.
Yep.
But how can we not make that mistake?
Well, I think, so let me be cautious about this, right? And here's what I mean by being cautious. You said it's a mistake, and that's what I'm reacting to. I don't think it's a mistake to say, here's how we think. Right? Logic is an account of how we think. He is saying this is how we think. Right? So there is an epistemological layer that you could pull off of this. Absolutely the case. Right? So I don't want to say, well, he's not talking about how we think. He is talking about how we think. But he's talking also about what the nature of being is at the same time, because they're not separable from one another. So the ontological dimension of it is driving the epistemological dimension is all I'm saying. Right? That thought and being are one. So when we say, well, we think about it this way, then we seem to be introducing the, well, this is how things are for us, not how they are in themselves, the phenomenal numeral distinction. And Hegel's saying, no, actually, this is not only how it is for us, this is how it is in itself. So this moment of extrinsic reflection looks to be that imposition of, oh, okay, well, this is how we ascribe things, but it's not how they are in themselves. That's that moment of, he says at one moment when he's talking about diversity, he says, this looks like the result of an act of comparing, and the act of comparing looks, vergleichen, and looks like at that point that that's just us doing. It's a subjective doing. It's one of the few times in the science of logic where he'll pull out and say, that looks like just us doing something. Pure epistemology, pure for us, not in itself. And then he immediately says, but actually no, because extrinsic reflection is determining reflection. This diversity, these moments of similarity and dissimilarity, are actually in the things themselves, as positive and negative. That's the argument he's making. So I get that. I get where the confusion comes from, I think, but also I want to acknowledge that it's not like he's saying we don't think this way. We absolutely do think this way, but it's not just the way we think. It's also the way things are at the same time. And that all goes back to the beginning of the book, from where must we start the science? We must start the science from where being, thought, and being are one. And so you can always, this is kind of, a broadly Spinozistic moment in Hegel. There's a lot of problems with identifying the two, but in Spinoza, you're always reading at one moment, well, it's about thought and it's about extension, right? Thought and being, if you want to put it in those terms. And those are two dimensions of the same thing. Absolutely right. I think that's where Hegel's at about this as well. He doesn't have all the other stuff that Spinoza has from those two sides, but at least that parallel dimensionality is working here because we've been able to demonstrate, not assert it, which is what Spinoza does, but been able to actually demonstrate that that's the case. Does that help at all?
So could we say that this is the unfolding of the logic is the unfolding of the possibility of thought, insofar as you have a differentiation between thought and being, just as this comes about ontologically.
Yeah, I like that. So you can say that it's the possibility of thought in a couple of different senses. I'm sure there's more than that, but just to build from what you're saying, it allows us to say, well, because of the nature of reality, part of the nature of reality is built into reality itself, is to think that nature is distinct from our thought, that it's something over against which we ascribe, that's what diversity is, we ascribe similarity and dissimilarity to. So it's that, and that's not wrong, right? But it's also not ultimately the truth of the matter. And this is standard Hegel, we get fixated on, that's it, there's only distinction there. There can't actually be identity. And he thinks, no, there's actually identity there. But he also wants to say, no, it seems that way, and it's not wrong to seem that way. There is a validity to that distinction. But that distinction, and that's ontologically grounded is what I'm saying, it has validity. But it's not just reducible or wholly about that alone. So the other thing you can say about this is about the possibility of thinking. I like that language because it also says, this is what it looks like to think, and this would be, broadly speaking, the norms of what it is to think. And the problem we have, right, is this pattern of thought doesn't seem to be, our standard, ordinary, common sense variety of thinking. And he'll say, right. But that doesn't mean that that's invalid, it just means that it's not what is ought, the normative sense of it, ought to be. So there's a normative dimension to what thinking is that's being expounded here as well. Is that useful or helpful?
Yeah, thanks.
Other questions or comments? Yeah, Alex.
Could you maybe spell out a little bit more directly that last claim that you made about what you see going on in this moment of the system is something like an undermining of essence's supremacy, and that this logic of subsumption and erasure of difference is in a way contested by what's going on here. I mean, I could see it going either way, but why do you see it going one way as opposed to the other? Because for me, everything that I've heard so far seems to leave both interpretive options still available.
Well, let's look at it this way. So if we said that if you push, I'm just going to use the Deleuzian language for this. If you push difference up to contradiction, then you've rendered difference something that is anthropological, something that's phenomenological, something you can assimilate and make use of and therefore incorporate, subsume within identity. And what you should do is allow it to be ontological and therefore not humanistic. Right? That's the charge. Right? And what I think Hegel's arguing is an essence to be an essence is necessarily its own negation. There is no identity that subsumes difference within it. Difference defines what it is to be identical. That's why to say an essence is identical is to say that it's self-contradictory, is an undermining of the way we understand an identity of an essence to be at all, the purity, the unity of an essence at all. As far as I can tell, that is a pretty straightforward rejection of the Platonic, Aristotelian, Thomistic conception of essence. And at that point, Hegel wants to say, right, that's because I've shown that to be an essence, is to necessarily be not itself. It is itself essence by not being itself. It's in contradiction with itself. And because of that, it's rendered null and void. It destroys it. So I don't see that as in any way to be capable of being read as, well, it's subsumed difference under the cloak of identity. That identity trumps and wins out. If anything, identity is destroyed. That's the lesson. So there is no such thing as absolute identity. There is no such thing as absolute difference, but there is no such thing for Hegel as absolute identity. Doesn't make any sense, conceptually. Not just because I can't find any examples of it, or I can't think possibly of it, but because as a matter of conceptual unfolding logic, essence can't be anything other than self-contradictory.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's the case for why it's not.
I think as we go further, it will be helpful, especially with the relationship between ground and what is grounded.
Yeah.
Because it seems still like there's almost an appropriation of what is grounded by ground. I mean, that's a produced other produced out of the same, the differing of the self-same. I guess it seems still like it could go either way to some extent.
Right, so let me just push that a little bit, because I think that can be helpful as a way of thinking where we're headed with this.
Yeah.
It will be the case that, I think, as I'll try to show here in just a moment, it will be the case that because essence is self-contradiction, that it's necessarily ground, that will give the ground, essence, priority over being, as we talked about a moment ago. So, and it will have to, because it's self-contradictory, it will have to appear, right? But it appears as the ground of the grounded. So the grounding relationship is, there's a priority to essence over against being, shine, appearance.
Yeah.
And there's where you might want to say, oh, well, it does have a priority. It may not have been subsumed under it, right? But it certainly is, to use the classic Platonic language, as I've talked about before, it certainly is tethered to it, right? And it seems to be beholden to it to be at all. That is, being is beholden to essence, or otherwise it can't be at all. That's the grounding relationship. I think that's absolutely the case, and that's what he means by essential relation. And so I'll sign on to all that. I think that's right. There are no essences without appearance, but what that entails for him is that they are the ground of that which is appearing. And that gives them priority. Ontological, epistemological, all that, right, gives them priority. He's then going to work through the grounding relationship, right? That's what the thing in its properties, the inner, the outer, all that stuff is. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And what that's ultimately going to show is that one can't have priority over the other. That's the move, right? Is essential relation is going to entail what he calls absolute relation. And absolute relation is the hallmark of what actuality is over against what we have so far, which is appearance. Actuality, note please, is the name for being. Right? So we didn't lose being in this process. But it's the name for being where essence and being are one, where one doesn't have priority over the other. Does that help at all, Alex?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Other questions, comments? All right, give me just a minute or two. We're not 4:21. Give me a few minutes here to work on essence as contradiction and what that entails. And then we'll take a break and we'll come back and look at the ground and what follows from that. All right, so just to kind of give you a location where I'm at in the text. I'm on pages 377 to 378. So this is pretty much right where we left off, 376 to 378. It's right where we left off at the end of last class. So what Hegel thinks he's shown at this point, what everything he's about to do flows from this claim, is that to be an essence is to be an identity, but to be an identity is to be in self-contradiction. So that's where he's at. And then notice immediately what he does. He argues that the concept of contradiction necessarily dissolves or resolves, you can read it both ways, dissolves, resolves, and that it dissolves or resolves itself into the concept of ground. So it dissolves, right? Essence dissolves because it's self-contradiction, dissolves, falls apart, hear it that way, but also resolves, becomes something, becomes ground. How does that work? So here I'm going to talk about two stages, because I do think there are two stages. He maps them out here on these pages. I'm going to unpack this argument in terms of two stages. So first, the first stage is this, right? Contradiction dissipates essence into nothing. So essence as an identity in self-contradiction with itself cannot maintain itself. It is itself and it's other at the same time. It is itself and it's not itself at the same time. Consequently, what is posited necessarily is posited as what is negative, and what is negative is necessarily posited as what is positive. The self-sufficient independence of either of the relata of an opposition is dissolved by the inherently self-contradictory standing of each. You can't get the negative out of the positive, you can't get the positive out of the negative, both of them collapse. The result is nullity, empty, vacuous, nothing. Here's the way he puts it on 376. This is second full paragraph down on 376. So just after contradiction resolves itself, in this self-excluding reflection we have just considered, the positive and the negative, each in its self-subsistence, sublights itself. Each is simply the passing over, or rather the self-translating of itself into its opposite. There is no positivity without negativity, there's no negativity without positivity. They are, to put it in language we've heard earlier, the same. This internal ceaseless vanishing, he's pulling back the language from being and nothing again, right? This internal ceaseless vanishing of the opposites is the first unity, marked first, right? Because it's not the final one, but it's the first unity, that arises by virtue of contradiction. So what does contradiction do to essence? It is null. Right? It dissipates it. It is nothing. And he says that's the first unity. So, I always think it's important in Hegel to give him his due, right? At that moment, he wants to say, look, what I've established thus far is that if negative and positive are necessarily indicative in one another, they're implicative in one another, they are endemic to one another, then neither one can stand. They're null and void, they're done, they're empty, they're vacuous, they're gone. They are dissipated. Right? They are destroyed, they're collapsed in on themselves. Essence can't stand on its own. Neither can being, by the way. They can't stand on their own. So because they're in self-contradiction, they are inherently undermining of themselves. But he says this nullity is only the first unity. So here's the second stage. The initial result is the initial result of the self-contradictory nature of essence. To be essence is to be posited as a relation of opposition. Each moment, the positive or the negative is self-contained, self-related, independent, insofar as it excludes its other. But if each is by virtue of excluding its other, then the independence of each moment, their self-subsistence, is destroyed by their very dependence on their other. So the way he puts it on 376 again, this is the next paragraph, the fourth paragraph down, the imminent reflection by virtue of which the sides of opposition are turned. Everybody see where I'm at? So about halfway down that, or right at the end of that paragraph. They fate themselves to founder, that line, right, it's in italics. They fate themselves to founder. Literally, they destroy themselves. That's what he's saying. Richten sich zugrunde. Since they determine themselves as self-identical, that's going all the way back, they are identical to themselves, right? But yet in their self-identity, they are rather the negative, a self-identity that is relation to other. So they fall apart, they destroy themselves. The relation of contradiction, therefore, dissolves and posits the identity of each of its relata. Dissolves them and is what they are, as dissolved, as null, as void. So it negates them, right? Is that the end of the account? No, he says. Take a look on 377 now. Take a look for the. See what I want to pick up. Give me a second. Yeah, so you have the very first line on 377. This is page 281 in the German. He says, it is sublating relation to itself. Everybody see where I'm at? So he's talking about as a void, as a null, as vanishing into as the positive vanishing to the negative, and as the negative vanishing to the positive. They're both nothing. He says that ceaseless vanishing of opposites to themselves is sublating self-relation. Sublating self-relation. How so? In that relation, it first, he says, sublates the negative, and it secondly posits itself as a negative. And it is only this posited negative that it sublates. In sublating the negative, it both posits and sublates it at the same time in this way. The exclusive determination is itself that other of itself of which it is the negation. You want to say, what the hell did he just say? We'll come back and try to unpack it. So just follow on to the end of the paragraph. The sublation of this positiveness is not, therefore, once more positiveness as the negative and other, but is self-withdrawal, positive self-unity. So there's where something's happened, right? You don't know what happened, that's fine, but something different's going on. Right? That's all I'm wanting you to know. Something different. He's trying to say, I said it was a nullity, and it is, but it's not just a nullity. Something else occurred in that destructive moment of self-contradiction where it dissipates the identity of essence, the identity of being. It actually destroys it, yes, but it doesn't just destroy it. It also does something else. It produces something. Positive self-unity. He says then, self-subsistence is thus unity that turns back into itself by virtue of its own negation. Its own negation. For it turns it into itself through the negation of its positiveness. It is the unity of essence to be identical with itself through the negation, not of an other, but of itself. Now think for a moment. This is sort of like the main lesson of the logic of essence in a way up to this point. Being's not with non-being, being is non-being. Well, essence is not with non-being, right? Essence is negation itself. So that's at least what he's trying to recall for you at the end there. But how does this really work? So walk back through this section with me. The ceaseless vanishing of opposites into themselves is a sublating self-relation. How so? In that relation, it first sublates the negative, and secondly, posits itself as negative. Okay, so he's identifying two operations going on here. That contradiction does two things. What's the first one? Well, it dissolves the negative. Right? It dissolves it completely. Excluding reflection dissolves the relation between the opposites, the positive and the negative. It excludes in that sense. It dissolves. It implodes. So it does that. But then he says, secondly, what does it do then? It posits itself as the negative. This is all still the work of self-contradiction. So it destroys it, but it doesn't just destroy it. It also posits something out of it. Negation's not just destructive, not just abstract. It is that, but it's also determined. Here it is, the second moment is the determining negation moment. So excluding reflection then posits itself as this relation between the opposites, the positive and negative. It therefore includes. It excludes, but it also includes. So in that way, the exclusive determination is itself that other of itself, of which it is a negation. So now it's established a relationship again. So it destroyed, rendered vacuous and empty, but then it also, through the same operation, posits something other than itself. In its destruction, it's positing something other than itself. So contradiction negates itself rather than something other than itself. It negates the negation of the positive and negative. It negates that destruction. So yeah, it destroys itself and negates itself, but it also negates that very negation. Here's the double negation, right? Here's the negation of the negation. So he then says, well, the result of that is that you have the positiveness is sublated. You've now got a positive self-unity. You've got one thing standing over in relationship to another. And he says now, the result of the negation of opposites is the establishment of their unity. So you now have a othering of it again, but also a bearing of their unity with respect to one another. What is this relationship that's now been established? So listen to what he's saying. Self-contradiction destroys essence. That's the first moment, no doubt about it, it's there. But in that same operation, not through a subsequent operation, but in that same operation, through that self-contradiction, you also get the destruction of the integrity of essence and the othering of it at the same time. And that othering of it establishes a relationship between essence, what had been essence, this vacuousness, and something else. What is that relationship? And Hegel says, glad you asked. That's ground. Whoa, that's not ground. Okay? Grounds are, the fundamentals of all things from which everything else is anchored and supported, built upon. That's what a ground is. Hegel says, I understand that completely. I know exactly what a ground is. I'm well familiar with what an axiomatic foundation is, right? An apodictic foundation. I know what all that stuff is. Wonderful, great. I read my facta, and I know what it is. But I also know that here's what essence does. It contradicts itself. And because it contradicts itself, it destroys itself as separable from being. And at that same moment, posits being as that which it bears a relation to. And what is it? How does it bear that relation? It bears the relation as that which posited being. Right? So positive being. So it's the ground of being. It's the ground of being. Now, think with me for just a moment. What Hegel's saying is that to be an essence is to be an identity, but to be an identity is to be in self-contradiction. So it is itself, but it's not itself. And because it is itself, but it's not itself, it's nothing. And if you stop there, you would go, there are no essences. Right? All is lost, all is gone, nothing remains. Right? Hegel says, I got you, I understand that, no problem. Right, that's how that works. I know the implication of what I've said. But I don't want to just stop with that and assume, well, we're done, because we may not be done. And so when you look again at that same operation of self-contradiction, you find that, yeah, it destroys essence, but what does it destroy about essence? It destroys its self-subsistence. It destroys its self-subsistence. It's standing on its own. But what does it do? It undermines its ability to stand on its own and posits that it stands in relationship to something else. Something that it's dependent on, Yes, something that's dependent on. There is no essence without that which it gives rise to. But it serves as the foundation, the ground of that which it gives rise to, because it posits that which it gives rise to. What does it give rise to? Being. Being. So now we have a grounding relationship. Not our standard understanding of grounding, not our standard understanding of essence, right? But it is why essence is the ground of being. So he says, this is on 377, this is right at the beginning of the next line down, right at 3 there, 377. First full paragraph down. According to this positive side, everybody see where I'm at? Okay. So he's just picking up on that moment and saying, look, there was something that happened here that wasn't simply destruction. There was also a positing going on here, a positive side that went on here, right? A constitutive, generative side. What is that? According to this positive side, since self-subsistence in opposition, as including reflection, makes itself into positiveness and equally sublates this positiveness, not only has opposition foundered, collapsed, dissipated, destroyed, not only what I said becomes null, it's not only that, it does do that, it's not only that, but in foundering and collapsing and destroying itself and going to the ground, it has gone back to its foundation, to its ground, so good again. It has fallen apart, it has dissipated, it has gone to the ground. Now, as I ended last class, you either think that's a brilliant understanding of how this works, or you think it's just a linguistic trick. He pulled up Zagrindigan and said, see? When it destroys itself, when it goes to the ground, it does actually go to the ground. It doesn't fall back into the earth, which is what that metaphor actually means. He's saying, no, it actually becomes the ground of something else. The argument doesn't hinge on the linguistic mode. The argument hinges, he just gives a name for it. That's why it's here. It's not back up where the actual argument is. The actual argument is the paragraph before. So now he's just saying, you know what that is, right? That's where you get ground. So he says, the excluding reflection of the self-subsisting opposition turns it into a negative, something only positive. It thereby, because of doing that, reduces its formally self-subsisting determination, the positive and the negative, to determinations which are only determinations of something more fundamental, a relation. And the positiveness that it's been constituted, since it is now made into positiveness, has simply gone back to its unity with itself. It is simple essence, but essence as ground. So you want to step back at that moment and go, hey, let me make sure I got you right. You're telling me that because essence is identity, and essence and identity is necessarily self-contradiction, that precisely because of that, not in spite of that, but because of that, it's ground. And Hegel says, yeah, that's exactly what I'm arguing. Well, how does that work? Again, it doesn't just destroy itself. Of course, self-contradiction completely undermines the self-subsistence of essence. Of course it does. And you will say, well, that obliterates. There are no more essences. Let's go home, right? We can just stay with being. Shut the book here. Let's get back to talking about qualitative, quantitative, measurelessness. That's all we got. And Hegel says, I get you, right? That's the null. I understand that completely, right? God is dead. Except for there is this founding relationship. There is this grounding relationship. Why? Because what the contradiction does is undermines the self-subsistence, the independence of essence. It necessarily needs, to use a bit of anthropological terms, being. It's the ground of something, and only insofar as it's the ground of something is it a ground at all. So we lost essence as transcendent, Platonic, otherworldly. Platonism is dead. Use that kind of historical reference, right? But the dimension of essence is not dead. Essence still operate. They operate as the ground of the grounding. So we can say then that a ground, this is on the bottom of 377 over 378, essence does two things as a ground. It excludes from itself. It's merely posited, right? So it excludes, it's still got that moment of rendering itself null and void. So it excludes from itself, but also does not, it dissolves back into itself, right? So it excludes from itself, this otherness, and dissolves, comes back together with itself. To be a ground, to be essence, is at once to posit something other than itself, which it thereby grounds. And in order to be the ground of that which it posits, it must be identical with itself, it must be in self-relation, it must be in and with respect to that which it grounds. So, to be an essence is to be in self-contradiction, and that means it others itself, and thereby grounds something other than itself, and comes to be itself precisely through that grounding. There is no other world, there is no second world, there is no in itself, behind, for itself. There is just this grounding relationship. Where one does have, so I'm going to hold on to this because it's an important moment. Notice, one does have priority over the other, right? Essence clearly as ground, not on its own, because there is no on its own. That's vacuous and nothing. It's self-contradictory into itself. But because it's self-contradictory, it others itself. Because it others itself, right, it generates being as its appearance. So now there's a grounding relationship between essence and being that makes essence be what it is. Essence is only the ground of that which it grounds. Nothing more, nothing less. It's vacuous into itself. There is no in itself. It only is in it so far as it displays itself. So when he writes, right, on 418, right, we'll come back and talk about a bit more about the grounding stuff in between this. But on 418, he famously writes, essence must appear. And by the way, in German, appears in italics, right? So Hegel's telling you, I mean this seriously, right? This isn't just about shine now, this is about erscheinen. They must appear. And the must there is crucial. It's not essences on a good day show up. Essences when they're happy, we'll let you see who they are. None of that crap, right? If you're, in the right state of mind, right frame of mind, you can see the participatory relationship. None of that crap, right? You have to look at the divided line, just sort of, none of that, John. Right? To be an essence, this is an ontological thing. To be an essence, it has to show itself. Otherwise, it's not an essence. Why? Because it's vacuous and void into itself. It doesn't have anything into itself. So he writes, continuing there, being is the absolute abstraction. This negativity is not something external to it, but being is rather being and nothing but being, only as this absolute negativity. Remember, this is the line about being's not with non-being, being is non-being. Well, how's that working now? Look at how he thinks about how it works. But conversely, essence, as simple as self-equality, is likewise being. There is nothing to essence except for that it is, right? That it grounds being. So there's no second world, right? There's no other transcendent domain. The doctrine of being contains the first proposition, being is essence. The second proposition, essence is being, constitutes the content of the first section of the doctrine of essence, where we've gotten to thus far. Right? This is the second section. So he's giving you here's the conclusion I think I've shown in the prior section. But this being into which essence makes itself is essential being. That's this, essential being. Appearance is essential being. Concrete existence, as he now calls it. Grounded appearance. As he says, a being which has come forth out of negativity and inwardness. It's come forth out of it because it's now the appearing of ground. Come forth out of the inwardness, which is ground. Now, it's come out of that depth. So now we can't call it shine anymore. Right? It's not just a surface and there's a depth lurking behind it. It just is what that depth is. It's the shining, right, of that depth. And therefore, this whole depth surface language has got to be complicated, right? Because it's not that which lurks behind it. It's that which shows itself, displays itself in it. One world, two dimensions. Ground and grounded. One has priority over the other? Absolutely. You can call it an epistemological priority, you can call it an ontological priority, logical priority, all that's true. But that's what he means by the essential relation. He's about to walk you through various instances of this, various different forms of this with thing and properties and world in itself, world of all that kind of stuff. We'll work our way through those briefly, but that's the claim he's wanting to make at that stage. Make some sense? Let's take a break. It's 4:43. Come back at 4:53, and we'll pick it up from there. Thanks.